Okay, so we are up to the story. In the story, we're up to chapter 9 of Genesis, toward the end, verse 26 or 27. And we'll read the verses inside. We discussed them last week also. And that is the blessings and the curse that Noah gives his children after the incident where he got drunk in the tent and he was uncovered, and one of the brothers ran to call the other brothers sort of just to gaze and just to see their father's debasement, whereas the other two brothers, Yafet and Shem, cover their father, and they each get a different and response when Noah awakes from his wine. He gives a response to each of the sons. Ham, he curses Ham by cursing his son, and he says his son should be a servant or a slave to his brothers. And then he blesses the god of Shem, and then he starts talking about Yafet. Yafet is interesting, and just to figure out what the verse is saying, is there are two ways of reading the verse of Yafet. So it's interesting. So we'll take a look. We'll read all the three verses again, and we'll see what we come up with again. So I'm reading chapter 9 in Genesis, verse 25. You know what? I could try to share the screen here. I think we have the technology in place, so why not? Let's see what we can do here. Okay, let's see if we can figure this one out. It's not my computer, but who knows? Who knows? Maybe it could be done. Here, oh, yeah, it's hiding right there. There we go. Okay. There we go. So this is chapter 9, scrolling down to the end. So this is verse 25. And he said, verse 24, Noah awoke from his wine, and he knew what his small son had done to him. So, and he said, cursed be Kenan, who's really his youngest son's son. He shall be a slave among slaves, a slave among slaves to his brethren. Literally, Eved Avadim, a slave to slaves. Okay, in any case, and he said, blessed be the Lord, the God of Shem, and may Kenan be a slave to them. We discussed this last week a little bit. We said, we focused on the idea that Shem, who's really the ancestor of Abraham, the blessing to Shem, he says, blessed is the Lord. Instead of blessing Shem, he blesses the Lord. And we discussed that one way of interpreting this is the greatest blessing to Shem is not that Shem receives something, as we will see, Yafet will receive something, but in fact, the blessing is that Shem has the ability to bless God, or the recognition to bless God. In other words, the greatest blessing to Shem is that you give him the awareness and understanding to connect to God, and that's the blessing that Shem receives. In any case, here we get to verse 27 is interesting. May God expand Yafet. Now this is a play on the word, because Yaft is translated as expand, because in Aramaic, the word Yaft is related to the word expand, and Aramaic and Hebrew are very, very close. So if there's a meaning in Aramaic, it also gives us indication that's the meaning in Hebrew. But the simple meaning of the word Yaft, even here, Yaft Elohim li Yafet. Yafet, Yafet is beauty. It's almost like God beautify, may God beautify Yafet. And we'll see in a moment that's indeed one of the interpretations. But here they're translating it the way Rashi does, based on the Aramaic translation. Yaft Elohim li Yafet, God expands, God should expand Yafet. And we'll see what that means, expand. Nevertheless, and may he dwell in the tents of Shem, and may Kenan be a slave to them. So it's almost like you have all three names in this verse. God will beautify or expand Yafet. God will dwell and he will dwell in tents of Shem, which we already mentioned. Shem will be blessed, or blessed is the God of Shem in verse 26. And then we reiterate again that Kenan should be a servant to them. Okay. The interesting question is, I never had this question until I started seeing the commentaries. I always read it one way, the classic way, but there's another way of reading it. If you look at 27 and you say, may God expand Yafet and may he dwell in the tents of Shem, who is the he? Who is the subject of the second clause? Yafet, may God expand Yafet. Okay, that we understand. The subject is God. God will expand Yafet. Okay, and may he dwell in the tents of Shem. Who is the he? Who should dwell in the tents of Shem?
God.
God. That's the classic interpretation. That's the way we always read it. And that's why Rashi also reads it. May God dwell in the tents of Shem. May God dwell in the tents of Shem. In other words, Yafet is beautiful. They have beauty. They have culture. They have music. They have art. They have beauty. But God dwells in the tents of Shem. That is the conventional interpretation. That is what I always read and I always understood. But now I'm seeing that there are other interpretations, and they read, no, not God. It's really Yafet. God will expand Yafet. God will make Yafet beautiful. And again, who's Yafet? Yafet is Greek culture, which becomes Roman culture, which becomes Western culture. But may Yafet go and study and learn and dwell in the tents of Shem. In other words, what this verse is telling us, the blessing to Yafet is not that Yafet should not stay in his own realm, which is the blessing of beauty, but that Yafet should actually go and dwell in the tents of Shem. Yafet should learn from Shem. And that's a different way of interpreting it. Again, it's not like Rashi, but other interpretations are saying this across the board, both Kabbalistic and others. And they say as follows: if you look historically, I'm quoting from the Torah Hamor, the Kabbalist I quoted from last week in the 16th century. But he says, if you look, and you will see that if you look at the Persian kings, Persia, which was a descendant with Persia, which is Paras, which was also a descendant of Yafet, as we will discuss in a moment. He says of the Persian kings, they were very close to the Jewish people. And where you see it the most clearly is the construction of the Second Temple. The construction of the Second Temple was by the permission and the support of Cyrus, Koresh, the king of Persia. So the king of Persia understood the value of the tents of Shem, tent of Shem meaning a dwelling place for God, and therefore they had this sense of closeness. Europe has this, Greece, and in other words, first Persia, then Greece, then Rome has this sense of learning from and being interested and being involved in the tents of Shem, in the holiness and spirituality of Shem. So if you read it this way, it's actually interesting that this is actually the entire blessing is a blessing for Yafet. In other words, that Yafet himself is expanded and beautiful, but nevertheless, he shouldn't remain in the realm of the beauty, of the natural beauties and the natural sciences, which again, logic is beautiful, but he should also seek the spirituality. But where does Yafet get the spirituality from? Yafet gets the spirituality from the tents of Shem. So that is, again, another way of reading the verse, as opposed to this conventional way, is that it's separation. God will beautify Yafet, nevertheless dwell in the tents of Shem. Here, the second interpretation is really bringing the two together, sort of making peace and harmony within Yafet, that Yafet himself is going to also learn from and dwell and go learn in the tents of Shem. So I thought that was interesting. I just want to reiterate what we said a few weeks ago, is why is it that the two brothers get different blessings? Yafet, in return for his, in other words, his pious act, his moral act of honoring his father, Yafet gets the blessing of beauty, and a beauty that sages interpreted as success in arts and culture, music, etc., and in sciences. And whereas Shem gets the blessing of spirituality, that God, he's blessed to God, he has a relationship with God, either only in verse 26 or verse 27. It depends how you read verse 27, if it's referring to God dwelling in the tent of Shem, or Yafet dwelling in the tent of Shem. But in any case, it's clear that Shem was the one that has the spiritual connection to God. And there was a commentary that explained that we mentioned it, I believe it was the the Netziv of Elazin, he said because they didn't do the same act. In other words, they did the same act, but they didn't do the same motivation. When they cover their father, why did they cover their father? What is the foundation of their morality? So Yafet, the foundation of Yafet's morality is logic. In other words, logic dictated his morality. And therefore, it wasn't necessarily a spiritual thing, it was a logical thing. And therefore, the blessing he gets in return, everything is measure for measure. The blessing he gets in return is because the foundation of his morality was logic, is to be blessed in the realm of human logic and human beauty. Whereas Shem does it because of the mitzvah, the morality that it says, it's not because I understand it, because this is God's will. And therefore he is blessed, not with not with the physical blessings of beauty and expansion, but with the spiritual blessing of relationship with God. So we mentioned that in the past, but I think that's good to reiterate when we're going through these blessings specifically. Now, another point that we see here. Yeah, go ahead, Bob.
Quick question. What do you think the significance is? This is a redo. This is chapter 1 again. We have Eden first, and then we reboot, and we have chapter 1 again. What do you think the significance of right in the preface of this chapter 1's, we have a distinction between such good and such evil? It's not like they even wait till the middle of the book to build the drama. It's like right in your face, Cain and Abel, right in your face, Shem and Ham. I mean, what is the significance? What is God trying to tell us in having it so blatant a distinction?
Okay, so that's a very good question. I was hoping to not have to address it. No, I'm kidding. That's a very good question. What's the big picture here? What's taking place? There are different ways of reading it. I think the most convincing way is to think about it in the context of the rainbow. And we discussed before that the rainbow is a sign that God will not bring a flood. But in addition to being a sign, the commentaries explain the rainbow is also a justification. The rainbow explains why God will not have to bring a flood. And the reason why God won't have to bring a flood is because it used to be that all the culture was homogeneous. Everybody was the same. And therefore, if the culture became a culture of corruption, then the entire society becomes spirals out of control and becomes corrupt to the point where you cannot self-correct anymore. And the solution to this problem, God understands, the solution to this problem is the understanding that no longer will there be one culture. And just like the rainbow, there are many colors to the rainbow. Society is going to have to break down into various different colors and shades. And the interesting truth is, and it's hard for some people to accept, but the interesting truth is that no one culture has all the truth and all the blessing. Okay, everybody has to understand that humanity as a whole make up the colors of the rainbow, and together we could seek to understand that we are all reflecting the light of God. And you cannot really fully understand the light of God until you have the entire spectrum of the rainbow, which basically means the variety of cultures. Everybody has their distinct blessing, but you need the combination of them all. And the side benefit of this is that even if one or multiple cultures become corrupt, it's not that all the cultures become corrupt. There are other cultures that will retain the loyalty to morality and to God. And over time, they can correct those other cultures that went off the deep end. So that's what we discussed about. The rainbow. The same idea could be said about the 3 sons of Noah. 3 sons of Noah, and later we're going to see, as we're going to see in a moment, right after this chapter is done, in a few verses, chapter 10, we're going to jump from 3 people to 70 nations. Okay, so we're sort of breaking up into the rainbow. The rainbow is we're breaking up into details, and there's an advantage to that, a disadvantage too, but an advantage to that as well. By the way, this must be the whole purpose of the story. It seems like this is the purpose of the story because later we run into the Tower of Babel, and this is where people want to become one again, and God is not so happy with the notion of becoming one. Why not? Well, because there's many interpretations. We'll get there later. But you see here that the oneness is a challenge. We need the rainbow. We need the multiple cultures. We need to understand that only when you have everybody together could you hope to reflect the light of God, because nobody has the entire truth. Okay, now let's go to the three sons of Noah. And Bob says correctly that they seem extreme. Here you have Shem, the most righteous, Ham, the most wicked, and it's also in the consequence, Ham is the servant, the slave, which is very negative. Meanwhile, Yafet seems to be in between. He's beautiful, and Shem has a relationship with God. So the commentaries explain, specifically, I'm quoting from Rabbi Shamshon Hirsch. He explains that the Torah keeps emphasizing the names of the three sons of Noah. And the three sons of Noah, he says they were born, and it keeps mentioning it, and they were the ones who entered the ark, and then the ones who emerged from the ark, and then the ones who God blesses, and it keeps mentioning these three names. So what Rabbi Shamshon Hirsch says, he says, look, it tells you that to rebuild the world, it's not that you need Shem, you need all three. And you need what they represent. Even though they seem totally extreme, there's no one way. You need all three ways, and they represent the three general cultures, but they also represent three general aspects within the human being. And when we look at ourselves, we also cannot say, oh, we just want to be the Shem, we just want to be the Yafet. No, you need to have all three. And that's the story here. And that's what the Torah is emphasizing. And that's the solution to moving forward, because this is an optimistic story. And even though sometimes it looks like we're taking one step back, but every time we take one step back, we're taking two steps forward. So what's happening here is how do you think about these three cultures? So Ham represents the passion, Yafet represents the intelligence, and the intelligence, but also everything that's humanly beautiful, intelligence, emotion, art, etc. And Shem represents the drive for meaning, for purpose. In Hebrew, Shem is the name, but what is the name? The name is, what is your name means what is your purpose in biblical Hebrew. When God appears to Moses at the burning bush, and God tells Moses to go to the Jewish people and tell them that God will take them out of Egypt. The first question Moses wants to know, I'm going to come to the Jewish people. You know what the first question they're going to ask? Not when are we leaving? Not when is the oppression going to stop? Not how can God allow bad things happen to good people? No, the first question they're going to ask is, what is your name? What does it mean? Because in Hebrew, what is your name means what is your purpose? What do you stand for? So that point here is that we all have we each within each person there's the passion, physical passion for pleasure. There's the intelligence, and that goes into the whole idea of beauty. And then there's the drive for purpose. Which one do you need for a person to be healthy? And which one do you need to rebuild the world and make the world a place, a home for God? So you would assume you can choose one or two. No, you need all three. That is exactly what the Torah is telling us by emphasizing that all three sons of Noah enter the ark. All three sons of Noah emerge from the ark. All three sons of Noah are blessed by God, because they're necessary to rebuild the world. If you're missing passion, you're not going to have ambition. You're not going to have the world. Now, within these three general feelings and general cultures, later we'll divide the three sons of Noah, generally divided into these three. Some cultures were more into spirituality. Some cultures were more into art and beauty. And some cultures were more into physical passion. And of course, that's why that perhaps Ham himself is not cursed. Kenan is cursed, the son of Ham. So that could mean that we're not, the actual drive for passion is not a bad thing. It's dangerous. It could lead you to negativity. And we mentioned this in the past already, but when Noah says, let Ham serve his brothers, let him be a slave to his brothers, there's two ways of reading it. We discussed one in the past, so I don't want to go into it right now. I just want, for the context of what we're discussing, is the passion has to serve a higher purpose. It has to serve either Yafet, either intellectual beauty or spiritual purpose. Because if you have the drive for passion by itself, if you let that control the other two, then that can lead to destruction. But the point here is, going back to Bob's original question, is why is it that we get such a divergence of people and of attitudes, right? Seem contradictory, but yet they're not contradictory. And we're going to talk about that in a minute, because that's verse That's verse 27. Where is it? I can't see if it's 26 or 27. Verse 27 is really talking about, at least we'll get to that in a minute, but it's talking about the harmony between these brothers. And that's the secret. The secret is there is no one path, there is no one culture that can rebuild the world. You need all three general cultures. That's true in society as a whole, and that's true within the individual person as well. And that is exactly the point, that even though they look very different, ultimately they could unite and they could join forces to create the perfect world. So I hope this makes sense, at least somewhat.
Yeah, and what you're really not saying is that it's not, the differences is not necessarily a pejorative. This is not really Cain and Abel 2.0. This is just, you need all the diversity together to create a new harmony.
Correct.
Which is different. Thank you.
Correct. Yeah. Okay, I just want to say two more short points, then we go to the big picture, then we continue. Just two of the short points, sort of details. Let God dwell in the tents of shame. Let God dwell in the tents of shame. What does it mean, the tents of shame, not as opposed to the homes? So you think about it, you think about Yafet, you're talking about Greece, you're talking about Rome. They're not building tents, they're building structures, they're building buildings. The tent represents a certain degree of impermanence. And the other place where it says tents in the Torah, certainly in the book of Genesis, is, okay, let me take a question. Zach, go ahead. I think you're asking a question. But we can't hear. I'm not sure you're asking. You're on mute. Okay, in any case, I'll speak, but don't feel free to open up and jump in at any point. The other place where it says the word tents in Genesis, oh no, you're not asking a question, it's my mouse. I apologize. Okay. The other place where the Torah says tents is, of course, Jacob. When the Torah describes the two brothers of Jacob and Esav, so it says Esav is a hunter, he's a man of the field, and Yaakov is a Ishtam, he's a wholesome or sincere person, Yoshev Ohalim, a dweller of tents. And the sages explain the tents means the tents of study, the tents of the study of Torah. He studied with Shem. Either it means the actual son of Noah or the descendants of the actual son of Noah. In any case, Jacob was studying the Torah, whatever the Torah looked like at that point. And the idea here is, when it says God dwells in the tents of Shem, it's an allusion to the fact of why God dwells in the tents of Shem, because tent is a metaphor of the tents of study. And because it's a metaphor for the tents of study, so the blessing is that God will dwell with Shem, because Shem is interested and occupied with the study of Torah. So just that word tent, if you look where else is it used, it's used in the context of Jacob, the descendants of Shem, related to the study of Torah, which explains why Jacob, why Shem is blessed in that sense, why God will dwell in Shem, and because of the advantage of the Torah that they have. Okay, let's talk about the beauty of Shem for a second, because we want to shift the beauty of Yafet, because we want to shift to the idea that it's not just the three different brothers becoming parents, becoming patriarchs, the three different cultures that are at war, even though they were at war for much of history. But ultimately, the purpose is to create harmony between the three. And therefore, if you look at at the verses, that's certainly the way the rabbis interpret the verses, we'll see something interesting. So verse 27, Yafet Elokim the Yafet, may God expand Yafet and may he dwell in the tents of Shem. So like I mentioned, Rashi, following the Targum, says Yafet is beautiful, is expand. But the simple meaning, anyone who knows Hebrew, you can't run away from Yafet, and Yafet is beauty. That's what the word means. So the rabbis also take this simple interpretation, and they say God either will make Yafet beauty or has made Yafet beauty. And the rabbis say Yafet is beautiful. Who's Yafet? Greece, Greek culture. And one halachic, what's the word I'm looking for? One halachic ramification of the beauty of Greek culture is the language of Greek. And what they say is as follows. They say that the Torah, to read the Torah in public, to write it on a scroll and read it in public, can only be done in two languages. It can only be done in Hebrew or in Greek. That's what the sages wrote in the Tractate Megillah. It's in the Mishnah. They said you cannot translate the Torah properly only in Greek. Greek was the language that the rabbis felt is the most susceptible to convey the nuances of Hebrew. Now, therefore, in times of the Mishnah, you were allowed to write the Torah in Greek, and it would have the same holiness as the Torah. So today we translate the Torah in English. It's a wonderful thing. And when you study the Torah in English, you get the mitzvah of studying Torah. Nevertheless, it does not have the same holiness as a Torah scroll. And you'll never see the Torah in English being written down in the Torah scroll. It's just, we don't do it. And the reason is because it's not, even though you lose some of the holiness in translation, because it's very hard to make a perfect translation. But the sages say that Greek language is so beautiful, they felt that the Torah could be translated into Greek. Now, it just happens to be that by now, the sages believe that the Greek that we have today is already diluted and lost. It's not the same as the rabbis were talking about, and we don't know how to use it in the same way. So that law doesn't apply. Now we won't translate the Torah even into Greek. But the point here is, how would the rabbis see this verse? The rabbis see Yafet Yafet. God made Yafet beautiful. In other words, Yafet is beautiful, and therefore the values of Shem can shine through the culture of Yafet. That is a sort of a harmony between the two. And others are saying the same thing. Others are going to say the same thing. Let me just pull this up here. So the first point we're saying, again, okay, so one more point here is that you have to look in the Yafet. God will expand Yafet, make Yafet beautiful. The sages also explain that it's referring to the second temple built with the permission of Koresh of Cyrus. And Rashi quotes that interpretation. And Rashi says that that's what the first half of the verse 27 is referring to. But let's just pull it open and you'll see in a minute what Rashi is saying. So we'll show the Rashi. So if you look at verse 27, and may he dwell in tents of shame. May he cause his presence to rest in Israel. The interpretation of the sages, however, is, although God will beautify Yafet, insofar as Cyrus, who was the son of the sons of Yafet, built the second temple, the Shekhinah did not rest therein. But where did it rest? In the first temple, built by Solomon, who was the son of Shem. From Yoma, Tractate Yoma, page 9b and 10a. What is Rashi saying? Rashi is saying is that the verse is referring to the second temple. The second temple was beautiful. Sages said, whoever did not see the second temple as it was, that wasn't really, as it was, the sages, okay, that's a little bit different. The sages said it about the second temple when it was renovated by Herod. Whoever didn't see the building of Herod never saw a beautiful building in his life. But in any case, the second temple was considered beautiful, and it was built by the descendants of Shem, by Cyrus, the king of Persia. Okay. Nevertheless, the second temple was not as holy as the first temple. Where do you see? The divine presence did not dwell in the temple. They did not have the ark. They didn't have the miracles that were present in the first temple, did not happen in the second temple. So according to the sages, what we're saying is, although the temple is beautiful, the second temple is beautiful, nevertheless, it's not as holy as the first temple, the temple built by Solomon. Okay, so that's one way to read it. Another way to read this is what you see here is that the harmony between the cultures of Yafet and Shem. And the point here is the temple could be built by Yafet. And a lot of the commentaries read this and they say that what is the purpose ultimately of all the advances of science and technology? So what the Torah here is telling you, you have to look in the Yafet. Why does God make Yafet beautiful? Why does God give Western culture, ultimately Greek culture is Western culture? Why does God give Western culture all this beauty and the success to be able to create beauty in the arts and sciences and technology? What is the purpose of it? It's not a means to. It's not an end to itself. It's a means to an end. What is the purpose? You have to look in the Yafet. God made Yafet beautiful so that he will be able to dwell in Shem. In other words, that the science and technology could help advance the teachings of Shem, the teachings of morality as brought down to the descendants of Shem, ultimately through the Torah and the Jewish people. In other words, this is not describing three separate cultures. It's describing the three separate cultures, each one excelling in their area to be able ultimately to reach the ultimate goal, including the third one that's also in this verse. The Kenan Eved Lamo and let Kenan be a servant to them. Again, it's the passions of either the culture or the individual person are necessary, but they're necessary. They can't be in the driver's seat. They have to be directed by either the mind or the sense of spirituality, and then you can have a wholesome reality. But again, the way to read this is it's not three separate verses. It's not three separate clauses. It's God makes Yafet beautiful. God blesses the technology and the science so that we can create a world that is a place of harmony because it's illuminated by the God who dwells in the tent of Shem. So ultimately, that's the vision where Noah blesses his three sons. And therefore, the curse is not really a curse, it's part of the blessing. So in other words, if you have three children that are so different, and Noah sees his three children are so different, even the two that did the same act of covering him were motivated by different philosophies. One was motivated by morality as the product of the human mind, of human logic, and one was motivated by the sense of spirituality, the sense of transcendence. So he says three sons, almost like how are they all the brothers? How are they in the same family? They're all so different. And then he blesses them and he describes their culture, but ultimately he's not trying to say you're ultimately going to be different. Ultimately, you all retaining your own spiritual makeup will come together to create the harmony that hopefully hopefully we're inching toward, and hopefully we will see speedily nowadays. So that's the story in short. That's I think one way to read this story and the various blessings that are coming together. Now, one interesting point is the word v'yishkon. May God dwell in the tents of Shem. The word v'yishkon, like mishkan, a dwelling place, we take it for granted because we hear it so often. But the commentaries point out that that would be a very foreign word. That would be a strange word, a strange way of describing a relationship with God. Nobody felt that a relationship with God means God will dwell in your tents. God will enter your home. That is not the way people thought about God. People, even until today, when they think about religion, they think about spirituality, they think of escaping the daily life, escaping the trappings of a society and separating and running away and becoming spiritual and running to the monastery and separating from human life to be able to come close to God. And here, Noah immediately, when he talks about Shem, he says, God will dwell in the tents of Shem. God dwells within the mundane life, within normal life. And again, we heard this so many times, so we're not inspired by this. But Noah immediately puts his finger on what the uniqueness of the teachings of Shem is, specifically through Judaism. And that is, like I always say, that we're not really a religion. We're not really designed, we're not a spiritual religion. We're not a religion that teaches you how to escape the mundane and come close to God. What we are about is sanctifying the mundane. And that is unique, and that is all tied, and that is alluded to in the word, which, like I said, we take it for granted. But the word v'yishkom, God dwelling, is a radical word. And that is something that Noah immediately says about Shem, because he already has the insight of how Shem's understanding of God is different than the conventional understanding of his time, but even the conventional understanding of today. Even today, it is unusual amongst religions to think about God in that way, God dwelling in my tent, God dwelling in my life, as opposed to me separating from my mundane life, going to the house of worship. And hope, if I can't, and if I could, maybe escape to the Himalaya. And that our idea of spirituality, of connection to God, is completely different. Again, all in that one word of the Yishkon. Okay, so I think we're going to make some progress. We're going to read the end of. We'll read the end of. We'll read the end of chapter 9, and we'll go into chapter 10, which at least for the first bunch of verses, at least till verse 9, is just names of people, names of cultures, which seems very boring. But of course, we have to see what is the Torah signaling by giving us all these names. But in any case, let's finish reading the chapter 9, and here we go. So he finishes blessing him in 27. And you get to verse 28. Noach lived after the flood 350 years. And all the days of Noach were 950 years, and he died. Okay, wonderful. Mazel tov. 10. Again, these are the generations of the sons of Noach, Shem, Ham, and Yafet. And sons were born to them after the flood. Now, I hope you're going to get bored when I read the next 8 verses, because that's what we're trying to get at. We're trying to get at, why do I need to know exactly how all these families, the 3 sons of Noach, become all these nations? So here we go. The sons of Yafet were Gomer, Magog, and Madai, and Yavan, and Tubal, and Meshech, and Tiras. By the way, we said Greece is the descendant of Yafet. Even in modern Hebrew, Yavan in modern Hebrew is Greece. I believe Tiras, the commentaries say Tiras is Paras, is Persia. Sons of Gomer, Ashkenaz, Rifat, Targimah. The sons of Yavan were Elishar, Tarshish, Kittim, Dodanim. From these, the islands of the nations separated in their lands, each one to his language, according to their families and their nations. And the sons of Ham were Cusha, Mitzrayim, Put, and Kenan. Sons of Cush were Sevach, Dan. And then you have Nimrod. We'll get to him in a second. And Cush begat Nimrod. He began to be a mighty man in the land. He was a mighty hunter. We'll get to him in a second. Okay, so we have Nimrod, and then we go back to from that land emerged Ashur. We keep going. We're not done yet. 13. Mitzrayim begat the Ludim and Anamim and Lahavim and the Naphthalim. Keeps going all the way down to then you get the children of Shem. You go all the way down to chapter 31, verse 31, 32. These are the sons of Shem, according to their families, according to their tongues, and their lands, according to their nations. These are the families of the sons of Noach, according to their generations, in their nations. And from these, the nations were separated on the earth after the flood. So you have 32 verses that, believe me, if this entire chapter did not exist, nobody would be upset. Nobody would lose sleep if I didn't know the exact names of the various languages. Now, I did skip a little bit. When we get to the character of Nimrod, it gets interesting. Verse 8, 9, 10, 11, 8, 9, 10, and maybe 11 are interesting. We'll get to that in a minute. But again, why do I need to know the specifics? Why can't you just tell me that there was 3 sons and they gave birth and they populated the entire culture? I need to know the exact lineage of all these peoples. The question is, how come? So there's one way to think about this is as follows. And one way to think about it is also to contrast this with other cultures at the time. So we're interested in history, we're interested in anthropology, and we're interested in geography. But in the ancient world, it wasn't that way. People were very interested in their culture, and they did not really spend too much time thinking about the origins and the culture and the stories of other cultures. They saw them as the other. Often they saw them as barbaric, and often we're going to go to war with them. We don't want to understand them. We don't want to understand their history. Maybe we'll feel connected to them. It will be harder to go to war. And here, what you see in chapter 10, the Torah is telling the reader of the Torah, which is primarily the Jewish people, but it's anybody who's going to read it, is it's not that way. In other words, it's not that our people are interesting to us and the other people are the other. Right at the beginning, right at the outset, after the flood, we are creating a lineage between all the known people, and we all have a common ancestor, and we're all from Noach, and we were all blessed by God when we left the ark. And what it's telling the Jewish people is that we shouldn't just focus on our culture. We have to understand that our story is interconnected with all the other nations of the world. And we have to understand it that way. And that's why later in the next parsha, when you have 10 generations after Noah, the descendant of Shem, Abraham, when God tells him, pack your bags and move from Gur Kasdim and go to Haran, and from Haran he says, go to Israel. He says there right in the beginning, he says, you're going to make you a great name, etc. He gives him all kinds of blessings. Right away in the beginning is sort of the first mission statement of Abraham as the father of the Jewish people, the patriarch of the Jewish people. He says, right, I will bless those who bless you, and I will curse, and him who curses you I will curse, and all the families of the earth shall be blessed through you. So one way to translate it is the way the article translates it, and that is, and all the families of the earth shall bless themselves by you. But in any way you read it, the blessing of Abraham is supposed to spill over ultimately to all the families of the earth. And where do you see that? You see that right here in the beginning, where we're not supposed to see ourselves as a people who are separate and apart and whose story does not overlap with the story of the rest of the world. We're unique, we have our own purpose and our own mission, but that purpose and mission ultimately is to affect all the descendants of Noah. And that's why it's clear we need to know not just the general idea, we all come from Noah, we all come from Adam. We have to understand the lineage and who gave birth to who. That puts our attention and our focus is that there is no such thing as an other. It's not like our culture. We're interested in our culture and the other people are not interesting to us. We need to know their lineage just like we need to know our own. So that is one way of thinking about why the Torah is spending so much time about these 70 nations and how they all emerge from Noah. By the way, this notion that thinking of ourselves in the back in relation and as part of the larger story also appears in the end of the Torah. The last day of Moshe's life, when Moshe sings the song of Ha'azinu, he sings a poetic song to the people, which is really a song that will predict the future. Also, in other words, tell them about the future, but also spends some time about the past. And there's a very interesting verse which I'll read, and it relates to what we're mentioning here. The verse says as follows. I'm reading it. I'm reading. I just want to save time, so I'm reading it. It's Deuteronomy chapter 32, verse 7. This is again Moshe speaking in the last day of his life. To remember the days of yore, understand the years of generation after generation. In other words, think about the history. Ask your father, and he will relate it to you. Your elders, and they will tell you. And this is the verse I want to think about. Verse 8. When the Supreme One gave the nations their inheritance, when he separated the children of man, he set the borders of the peoples according to the number of the children of Israel. Again, when he separated, he set the borders of the peoples according to the numbers of the children of Israel. What does that mean? So Rashi over there explains the fact that there were 70 nations in the ancient world, 70 nations mentioned here in this Genesis chapter 10. These 70 nations, why do they have, why is the number 70 significant? They correspond to the 70 souls, which were the root souls of the Jewish people. When Jacob goes down to Egypt with his family, the Torah gives us the count, and the Torah says there were 70 souls that enter Egypt. So what Moshe is doing at the end of his life is explaining to the Jewish people, understand that your story, the fact that you begin as 70 souls, that is a reflection of the fact that there are 70 nations in the world. In other words, Moshe is reminding them this point, that we are not in a vacuum. Our story is not separate and independent from the stories of the people, but we're a branch of humanity, but our purpose is to remain connected and ultimately to influence the rest of humanity to create that harmony that we were talking about earlier today. So that is just to give context to chapter 10. Next time you read it in the synagogue, it's not so boring. It has a very deep message. The message is how we understand ourselves in the context of the family of humanity. Okay, now we're going to proceed and go and talk a little bit about one family and one individual named Nimrod, because he is interesting to us. And there are various ways of reading it, but we don't have that much time. We have about 6-7 minutes. I have to leave a few minutes early, but I think it's enough time to get into the story and make some interesting points.
Rabbi, one quick question.
Yes, please.
The fact that the Torah was translated into Greek, or permitted to be translated into Greek, doesn't that conflict with the prohibition of teaching Torah to non-Jews?
It's not necessarily. In other words, the day when the Septuagint was made, according to the tradition, when Jewish tradition, when the Jewish people when the Greek king had the Jewish people, the sages translate the Torah into 70 languages, that was considered a sad day. I'm sorry, had the Torah translated into Greek, that was considered a sad day. That was only a problem because the sages were forced to mistranslate the Torah, lest the king make mistakes in its meaning. So the Talmud mentions the 15 places where the Greeks where the sages changed the meaning. But the concept of translating the Torah itself is something good. We see this according to the sages that Moshe, 36 days before he passes away, begins to explain the Torah in Deuteronomy. It says Moshe began to explain the Torah, and the sages say that Moshe translated the Torah into 70 languages. Now, what you're referring to is that you're not allowed to teach Torah to Gentiles. That is specifically the oral Torah, and that's specifically the laws of the Torah that are not relevant to them, that they don't have to keep. In other words, our understanding of Torah, it's not just Torah is something interesting. It's nice to learn about a different culture. Torah is a lesson, and Torah is something that you have to internalize. And we're not supposed to teach the parts of the Torah, like the details of the laws that are not relevant to them, that we don't have to teach, because that would make Torah just an intellectual pursuit, and we don't like that idea. But the notion of the written Torah, which explains the unity of God and the Ten Commandments, etc., that is something that Moshe himself engages in, translating the Torah in 70 languages, which is certainly the audience was of the Gentile world, because at that point the Jews only spoke Hebrew.
Thank you.
Okay, let's look a little bit at this gentleman who's a fascinating character. Whoops, wrong screen. Am I sharing? Oh, I'm not sharing anything. That's a bigger problem. Okay, what's going on here? I don't know what I'm doing. Okay, here we go. This is an interesting character. So we're talking about the descendants of Yafet in the beginning. Then we go to the children of Shem. So let's read verse 6. The sons of Shem were Cush and Mitzrayim, Put and Kenan. The sons of Cush were Seba, Chavila, Sapta, Rama, and Saftecha. The sons of Rama were Seba and Dedan. Cush begot Nimrod. He began to be a mighty man in the land. So for the first time, we're talking about the 70 nations. We hear about a person, an individual person, Nimrod. Nimrod begins to be a mighty man. Now, the word Nimrod, if you know modern Hebrew, Nimrod is marad. The root is rebellion. So you already know that the Torah, it's a negative name, rebelling against who? So it seems like rebelling against God. And the Medrash talks about Nimrod rebelled against God, and Nimrod was sort of a negative, sort of moving people away from the understanding of God. But that's the Medrash. The simple meaning, it's not so easy to see that in the verses. Verse 9 is very tricky to understand. He was a mighty hunter before the Lord. Therefore it is said, like Nimrod, a mighty hunter before the Lord. What is verse 9 telling? Is it positive? Is it negative? Is he a good person? Is he a bad person? Before the Lord sounds pretty positive to me. We're not done yet. Verse 10. And the beginning of his kingdom was Babylon, and Erech and Akkad and Calneh in the land of Shinar, which is Babylonia. From that land emerged Ashur. Emerged, I'm not sure emerged is the right word. Yatsa, they emerged, but they left. Ashur left. Ashur is Assyria. Assyria left Babylon in the days of Nimrod, and he built, who's he? Assyria, Ashur built Nineveh and Rehovot, Ir and Kalach, and Resen between Nineveh and between Kalach. That is the great city. We know that Nineveh was called the great city in the ancient world. Even in the book of Jonah, it's called Nineveh. God sends Jonah to Nineveh, to the great city. The great city before God. Okay, what is happening here? What do I need to know? What's the takeaway? What are we telling me about Nimrod? He was a mighty man. He was before God, but we're also saying his name was Nimrod. His name was rebellion. And like I said, the sages believe that he was rebelling people, moving people away from God. And then I need to know that he built a city. He had a kingdom. His kingdom began in Babel, and it was expanding. And then Ashur left. They weren't happy with him. They went to Nineveh. They built Nineveh. What am I supposed to do with this information other than the anthropology and the geography of the ancient world? What exactly is happening here? What's the takeaway? And how does this tie into the previous story? So there are all kinds of ways of reading this. I'll give you one or two. So I'll give you two ways of reading this in two opposing ways. But what everybody agrees is that it's very hard to say that Nineveh, that everyone agrees that the term before God sounds like is a positive term. He was a mighty hunter before the Lord. Therefore, it is said, like Nimrod, a mighty hunter before the Lord. But the second half of the phrase, therefore, as it is said, is just what people said. It doesn't mean it's true. But the first half is the narrator talking. It sounds like we're saying he was a mighty hunter before the Lord. Lifnei Hashem sounds like something positive. And we know he was the first king and he has a kingdom. Is the Torah tell us that a monarchy is good? Is the Torah telling us that it's very good that Nimrod was a king? Right? Because it doesn't say he was a king. Verse 10, it says not only was a king, but he also has a kingdom. His kingdom is expanding. It's not just in the kingdom of one little city, but his kingdom is expanding. The beginning of his kingdom was Babylon, which implies that the kingdom is expanding. So is that a positive or a negative? So one interpretation is that the concept of creating a king, the first guy who invents the monarchy, not just over a leader of a tribe, but I'm a king over an area, and I want my kingdom to expand, and I want people to serve me, is Nimrod. Nevertheless, the fact that Torah says that it was before God is because that's a positive. What is a positive? So we know that the sages believe that a kingdom is better than anarchy. It says in the Ethics of the Fathers, you should always pray for the peace, for the well-being of the kingdom, because if not for a kingdom, anarchy is worse and people will swallow each other alive. If you don't believe this, open up a television and see what's going on in the kingdoms where there are no kingdoms and there are basically just tribalism, and you'll see what's happening there, and you realize the wisdom of the sages who said about the Roman Empire, which was a terrible empire, which was very bad for the Jews and very oppressive to the Jewish people and Jewish religion. Nevertheless, the sages believed that it's not as bad as anarchy. So the concept that Nimrod becomes a mighty man in the land, becomes a king, is before God. That's the divine plan. The divine plan is, yes, a king has many problems. Monarchy has a lot of problems, but it's better than anarchy. That is one interpretation. Now I'm going to give you the opposite interpretation and say that even though the whole problem with Nimrod is that he's so clever that he uses the term that it's supposed to be a positive thing and he uses it for the negative. In other words, the notion that I am a king and you have to rule and you have to serve me and I have power, but the notion that power that I have, it's not just that I'm stronger than you, but that's a divine proof that I have to rule over you and you have to submit yourself to me because that's the divine will. That's the creation of Nimrod. Nimrod was clever. It wasn't just that he created the concept of a king, but he created the idea that God supports the king, that God wants me to be the king and therefore you have to serve me. And what's interesting is he was the mighty hunter before the Lord. What does hunting mean? So you could say, well, he was a hunter. He was a hunter. And because he's such a successful hunter, that's why they appointed him the king. That's one way to read it. But Said, hunting in the Bible, doesn't only mean hunting animals. Hunting also means tricking people, right? When the sages say, when it says that Asaph Isaac loved Esau because Said Befiv, there was game in his mouth. So the sages explain it doesn't just mean he brought him good steak. It means he would trick his father. He would ask his father questions, implying that he's a moral person. In reality, he wasn't. So he's hunting, he's gaming, he's tricking his father. In this case, Nimrod was a mighty man on the earth. He was a mighty hunter. Mighty hunter means he was a tricker before God. What does it mean before God? Before God means he would tell people the fact that I'm stronger is an endorsement of God, and God wants me to serve you. Now, gets more interesting. Nimrod is a descendant of Kenan. Kenan was the son of Noah, who was cursed with the idea of he will be a servant. Let's think about this for a second. What do we know? As soon as Nimrod's kingdom starts expanding from Babylonia, starts expanding, I believe, eastward, I believe southeast, even though I may be mistaken, I think southeast, the people that Nimrod is expanding into territory of Shem. I'm sorry, of Yafet. Yafet is beautiful. They have arts, they have science, they have cultures, they can build big cities. The people of Shem, of Yafet, are not interested in this king. So they move away and they build Nineveh. So verse 11 is really a rejection of verse 10. In other words, because the beginning of his kingdom was Babylon and Erech and Akkad and Calneh, in the land of Shinar, that's why, from that land emerged Ashur, Assyria, which we already know earlier in the page, it says Assyria is the descendant of Yafet. Yafet says we don't want anything to do with this kingdom. We're out of town. We're going to go build our own kingdom. We're going to go build our own city. What is happening here? So one way to read this is absolutely fascinating. And that is that in the culture of Shem, when Jacob blesses them, and when Noah curses them and says, you're going to be a servant of servants. Remember, I didn't explain that verse. It says, he'll be a servant of servants of his brothers. So one way to read this is that the people in the culture of Ham was very willing to accept the idea of hierarchy. And therefore, if you look at that culture, there are layers. There are kings and kings of kings. The whole system, the whole culture was set up as not just one king, but a series of kings. And the people on the bottom are not just servants, but they're servants to servants because their kings are also servants. And that's how the society of Ham was built, because they were accepting of that culture. Yafet and Shem were not accepting of that culture. Where do you see that? You see that when you go to the land of Israel, next parsha, you see that there's 4 kings and 5 kings. In a small geographical area, the ancient land of Israel, maybe some of Jordan, there are no less than 9 kings. And the 5 kings are paying taxes to the 4 kings. And then eventually the 5 kings stop paying taxes and they rebel against the 4 kings. And then there's a tremendous battle. And then Abraham emerges on the scene. We'll get to that later. What do you see? You see in a small little territory, there are 9 kings. Why are there 9 kings? And why are there layers? Why is Nimrod, according to the sages, Amraphel, one of the leader of the 4 kings is really Nimrod. Sages say Amraphel is Nimrod. We'll get to that later. I'm running out of time here. What we're trying to say here is that the culture of Kenan is already forming based on Noah's diagnosis. It's not a curse, it's a diagnosis. He's saying the people of Ham were accepting of hierarchy. They were not accepting the idea that all people are created equal under God. And Shem and Yafet were much more susceptible to that philosophy. And therefore, Abraham goes to war against the 4 kings, not only because, as we'll read later, he's trying to help his nephew, but it's because there is a philosophical debate between Shem and Ham, and the Shem and the descendants of Ham, epitomized through Nimrod, where they say people have to serve other people who in turn serve other people. And Abraham says people have to serve God, and before God, everybody is equal. Now, ultimately, this is the battle between. This is where the description and the diagnosis that Noah gives to his children. Kenan would be a servant of servants, whereas God will dwell in the land of Shem, and where there's God, there's no hierarchy before God. So chapter 10, these verses in chapter 10 is playing out that understanding and insight that Noah had within his own children. And here we see how it played out in society. So this is the story in short. A lot more to say about and say in general, a lot more to say about this, but unfortunately we ran out of time. God willing, next week we're back in person for those who want to join, and hope everybody is going to be good electricity and all that. We were away for Shabbos. We were planning on coming home today, but